Recently, we've been going through The Last Laugh, one of the stories picked out at random for the Joker in what turned out to be a series of videos that took me a very long time to get through. It was a fun and interesting experience on the whole, and one that I enjoyed, even if we'll be doing random reviews very differently from now on. However, I do have to say, out of all the Joker comics I reviewed, The Last Laugh was one of the most consistently disappointing. It wasn't a terrible story, there's a lot to like here, but thinking about what The Last Laugh is, what it represents, and what it could be, there is a lot to be desired. First of all, this is one of the few crossover events in DC entirely dedicated to the Joker. That alone should make this special for reasons I shouldn't even have to tell any of you. Sure, the Joker is star of plenty of Batman crossovers and that sort of thing, but The Last Laugh remains rare in DC history in that it is the Joker launching a direct attack on the entire DC lineup. Not only that, but unlike in stories where the Joker has had a big role in crossover events before or since, like Infinite Crisis, the Joker doesn't really have to share a spotlight with anyone here. He is unambiguously the star of this show, no matter how many other characters are included. Even President Lex Luthor, the entire Justice League, and pretty much any hero or villain the company was willing to spare, they're all either stacked up against the Joker or an unwitting pawn of this villain in his grand, supposedly final scheme. So we have one of the biggest villains in all of DC Comics with this rare and unique moment to really shine. We also have Chuck Dixon, easily one of the more significant Batman writers in the character's long history, scripting the main series of Last Laugh. In addition to that, he also, at least indirectly, had access to most of the company's behind-the-scenes talent for an entire month. Every major writer, artist, editor, they were all making tie-ins to The Last Laugh. These sorts of crossovers aren't new, sure, but the opportunity they represent shouldn't be ignored or discarded either, especially since I can't really think of a similar Joker-themed event that compares in scale to this. Emperor Joker is probably closest, but even that was only featured in a much smaller amount of books. This could, and really truly should have been, one of the more significant stories in Joker history. But instead it feels like an often overlooked chapter in the villain's story, almost forgotten after 20 years or so as of this writing. And I don't think that just randomly happened. I think a lot of Last Laugh's limitations are pretty easy to spot, in fact. I'm assuming most people can intuit what is wrong with Robin's fake-out death in this story and how badly that cheapens the brand and these types of crossovers. If this was a story that actually killed off Tim Drake, even for a time, or established that Dick Grayson straight up murders the Joker, even if it was just in this narrow little corner of DC continuity, well, at least you'd have something memorable. Something that could have been built on a bit, or at least used until the New 52 reboot at the end of the 2000s. That would have left at least a little bit of an impact on our characters, or their view of each other, their sense of justice, or how they see the Joker and other villains. But none of that happens. Nothing really changes in this story. Batman remains unflapped, unchallenged, and unwavering in his existing beliefs and methodology. Nightwing is shaken, but ultimately not guilty of murder, and also realistically no worse than where he started. The same can be said for Robin and the hundreds of villains who are infected and compelled to do terrible things, many far beyond anything they would normally have ever done were they not affected by the Joker gas. The entire continental US is flooded with a Joker toxin storm. A prison is blipped out of reality and emerges near the South Pole, which is now Dr. Polaris, by the way. All of these stories should be huge in their weight, the scale of it all, and the effects on these characters long term, far more than even your average comic book crossover event. These plot points scream the sorts of things that would take any country years to rebuild from. I feel if this had happened in our world, we as a society would still be traumatized by it 2 decades after the fact. Villains would be forever haunted by the trauma of their actions during this time, while others would be equally forever broken by the actions of said villains. Heroes should be hurt, lives should be ruined. I take no glee or solace in this, but it's just a natural consequence of what we're seeing in this story. This is how things should be given what has happened here. I guess superhero stories are often guilty of this trend, but I just feel as though The Last Laugh is a particularly bad example of it. Unfortunately, I think this story really struggles with this sense of follow-through and consequences. Compared to other Batman-themed stories at the time, like War Games or No Man's Land, and it really feels like we're just not left with anything that leaves the Batman family shaken in any way that sticks. And that feels almost tragic, because the Jokerized villains sound like a neat idea, it just really isn't used all that much or well. Lex Luthor, who's president, is infected for pretty much a single tie-in comic, and he barely gets to do anything all that significant since Superman is immediately there and able to stop him, even though in other stories Superman is nowhere to be found. Lex then goes back to normal and the whole thing isn't really mentioned again. While there are some interesting choices of infected villains in one-off stories or in limited roles, like King Shark, Killer Croc, Deadshot, Dr. Polaris, and a handful of others, most of the infected characters we focus on for multiple issues are pretty boring choices. Few others in Batman's usual roster of villains are shown infected, and a bunch of other DC classic characters are notably absent here too. It's just one disappointment after another with The Last Laugh in a lot of ways. And I can't really get over how frustrating that feels. There's a point to be made in a story like this. Chuck Dixon has some real thoughts on the nature of justice and what is the appropriate action when dealing with something like the Joker. This is a question with no easy answers, so making it front and center as a point of contention across the Last Laugh main series feels like a very worthy goal for the crossover event to take. I would argue my favorite parts of The Last Laugh are when Barbara and Grayson are just debating this stuff and talking to each other about how they feel about the Joker. It's pretty interesting and a rare moment that actually gives weight to the Joker's actions here, something we otherwise rarely see in these books. I think it's very telling that these are the parts that wound up being most compelling to me in a story where the entire country is being attacked. Even then, I do think The Last Laugh is a bit of an indication of where Chuck Dixon's mind was heading as we went into the 21st century. Already, it doesn't feel like the writer that created Spoiler, Birds of Prey, and many other great runs in Marvel and DC over the years is the same man that wrote this. This is a man growing more cynical as he exits the 90s. I feel like there's a reason I just stopped connecting with his books after a while, and Last Laugh is a pretty good expression of that and why it is. There's this sensibility to The Last Laugh, acting as if evil is besetting us on all sides. We're just surrounded by crazy people constantly out to hurt you, steal from you, and all manner of other madness. It really takes the big and wonderful authority figures of the world to make things right. Most specifically, prison guards, police, and the military. These are the good guys. While other government agents, more divorced from those three categories, are much more of a mixed bag. Mental health? Oh, that just barely even really exists in part of this equation. They're just crazy and evil. Everyone needs to work out their problems simply by punching or locking people away in permanent solitary confinement. Or literally locking them in a room with a corpse. This is the mind of somebody who has just not had to deal with certain realities in life. The Chuck Dixon that wrote these books did so with a very narrow definition of evil and morality. He fails to acknowledge why Batman, or really any superhero, is necessary to begin with. There's a good reason why the Dark Knight's partnership with the police is generally only supposed to be tenuous at best, rarely trusting more than one police officer at a time, and it isn't because vigilantism is illegal. I don't get the impression Dixon would agree though. Marshal Dina Bell straight up murders a guy and almost dooms everyone in the slab because she is so trigger happy. Maybe the situation is warranted, but it sure feels like she endangers everyone in the prison because of her violent tendencies, and doesn't really seem to face any real consequences for it, or be treated like the other villains. A lack of consequences is a bit of a recurring problem for The Last Laugh, to be fair, but here it feels especially egregious. I would argue this is where Dixon, and really most of the other tie-in writers for The Last Laugh, just refuse to engage with the deeper issues lying behind crime and justice, and maybe I'm asking too much of these stories that are supposed to be just fun superhero adventures, But to that I'd point out that I'm not the one who brought up the morality of executing a villain on sight, am I? Sure, it is easy to say that the Joker deserves death. He's proven despicable and violent at every opportunity afforded to him. But what about somebody like Dr. Polaris? The dude was so severely abused he developed dissociative identity disorder. He then accidentally gave himself powers that he did not really fully understand or ask for, and then for this story got infected by the Joker toxin against his will. Yes, he is a violent and dangerous person, but where in his life history did he decide to be that way? It's not in the narrative. He is, in many ways, a victim as much as he is a victimizer. I'm not saying the man deserves all the compassion in the world, or that he should be allowed to run wild around the planet unchecked. As it is established in this story, he will literally kill everyone at that point if this happens. But there has to be a middle ground between that and locking him up in a tiny cell with a dead and rotting body. That is so messed up, and I don't think it's right for the last laugh to just sort of brush this state-controlled violence to the side like that. And is it not disappointing? Is the theme of this story not violence? The Joker thinks he is dying and is inflicting this tremendous and enormous violence on the world, the scale of which is difficult to fully picture. I wish the comics did a better job of expressing that coherently. They got kind of close, but I feel like this plot in many ways is unrealized and badly structured in addressing these ideas. Because there are a lot of cool concepts here that could explore this notion. The attacks on prisons around the country, the storm of Joker toxin affecting innocent people, or even the infected President of the United States. These are all huge plot points that could have changed the history of DC forever. Instead, however, most of these ideas are barely given enough attention to fill a single issue of a comic book. So, yeah, I think The Last Laugh is pretty severely flawed, but it wasn't the worst experience in the world. It wasn't a great crossover, just a decent one. But all of that is just my opinion. Let me know what yours is in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and if you want to see more videos, be sure to subscribe to Comic Island. And until I'm back to talk about something, I'll see you guys next time.